IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Anirudh Kanisetti. I'm joined today by Pranav RS and Sarthak Pradhan, Takshashila's newest employee, and we're going to be discussing The Economist. Now, I'm sure that as all of you know, it's been quite a turbulent weekend in India. There's been we are really it feels like we're at a kind of crossroads when it comes to the health of our institutions and our democracy. And I promise that that's something that we're going to address in this podcast a little down the way. But for now, we'd like to kind of decontextualize, look at where India is, where the world is this week. But before we begin, just a quick public service announcement. If you're looking to transition to a career in public policy, come study at the Takshashila Institution. We offer both graduate and postgraduate programs in public policy. Applications are now open for the upcoming January 2020 cohort. Visit takshashila.org.in to find out more. So without any further ado, let's get to today's podcast. So, hello Sarthak, welcome.
Hi Anirudh.
As our listeners should probably know, Sarthak is actually an alumnus of our postgraduate program. But tell us a bit about yourself, Sarthak.
Hi, I'm Sarthak, and I have, as Anirudh mentioned, I'm an alum of Takshashila Institution. At Takshashila, I will be taking classes specifically related to economic reasoning. And apart from this, I will be doing research across multiple disciplines. Mostly my research will be focusing on economics and also something to do with geopolitics. So we can start the discussion?
Yeah, cool. So since Sarthak is the economist here and we are going to be actually talking about the economist, let's begin with a sort of macro problem that humanity is kind of facing right now, right? Which is, of course, climate change. And I think that some pretty pivotal developments are in the works right now. There was an agreement, there was a meet in Madrid which I think didn't really agree to the kind of emission targets that we need to achieve to really stop climate change in its tracks. But the European Union still has some kind of deal, am I right?
Yeah. So not Madrid, but the focus of attention last week was in Brussels. There the president of the European Commission announced the Green Deal. And the president of the European Commission used the term that this is similar to Europe's man landing on the moon. That kind of moment, that significant this moment is going to be. Now, what she is saying here is she wants to reconcile economy with planet. So the plan here is by 2050, Europe is going to be carbon neutral. That is the aim here. This is the magnitude of the scale of the issue she is talking about.
So does she propose to do that by reducing emissions or through negative emissions?
She is saying both the things, okay? Reduce emissions and also offset emissions. Okay, that is also what is being mentioned here. And if this happens, then this entire block, this is going to be the largest block, the biggest GHG emitter, which will cease to do that, or it is going to offset that. So what they are saying is, by 2050, the target is 2050 here, they are going to reduce emissions such that the increase in temperature as compared to the pre-industrial levels will remain somewhere around 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius.
And how do they plan to do that?
Yeah. So here they are saying that for doing all these things, they will be requiring somewhere around $175 to $290 billion per year. That's huge. Okay. So for this, again, they want to incentivize the private sector to do that. They will be focusing a lot on financial regulations. That means they're trying to define what kind of product will be a green product. And accordingly, finances will be going to that particular area. Apart from that, there is one European investment bank right now, which has a huge corpus, somewhere around $550 billion. Now, this is going to gradually get transitioned into a climate bank. So the corpus they have right now, it is a development bank. It will be funding different kind of green projects. And yes, they are coming up with a definition of what is a green project.
So we're talking about stuff like renewable energy products or...
Yeah, renewable energy products. The products which can decrease climate change. So again, they have not come up with those regulations right now. They will be focusing on the regulations. Accordingly, they will incentivize private sector to make those kind of products. Okay. So private sector investment will be the key, and that will be through financial regulations. And at present, EIB is funding, 28% of its fund is going to these kind of projects, but the target is around 50% of the fund, 50% of the corpus of AIB should be going to these kind of projects. Okay, so that is how they are planning to do it.
And I believe that the Economist also had an article on how central banks might play a role in this whole thing, right? So what exactly had to say about that?
No, central bank, yes. See, the article on central bank is about something a little different here. Now, see, different countries are trying to grapple with the issue of climate change. They have different kind of targets here. But there is another thing here as well. There is a risk that some institutions within the government might be going to the other end. And this is what is being pointed out in the Economist article. They are saying that some central banks are possibly going to the other end. What they are doing, they are focusing on climate policy. It should be rather the government which should be doing it. Central bank, they have a different kind of mandate.
So can you give us an example of how central banks are doing this?
Yeah. For example, now, what is the role of a central bank? The central bank focuses on monetary policy. At the same time, it ensures that the entire financial architecture is not facing any kind of risk. The banks have sufficient amount of funds for any kind of future economic risk. For example, there might be recession, whether they have sufficient funds for addressing that. Now, some central banks, what they're doing, they're introducing climate risk as another mechanism to test it. That means a bank might have given loans to different kind of institutions. But in case there is a climate change related incident, will the bank be able to, has the bank accounted for that kind of climate risk? Okay, so new kind of parameters are being added to find out whether they are able to address any future climate risk.
And the argument is that basically central banks should not have this within their mandate.
See, the problem here is you are saying that why they are going ahead with it. You are assuming that climate risk is going to pose a threat to the economic system. That is true. Okay, in future that might be that will happen. That might happen, but there is an immediate crisis as well. If you all of a sudden change policies, it can be a larger crisis. One thing is that. Second thing is whether the central banks have the democratic mandate to do this. See, many things can impact the financial system, the economic system. Maybe there is a health issue. There might be a disease, pandemic. It can also impact the economy. So can the central banks make regulations for that?
No.
Okay, so those kind of questions are raised. And eventually what might happen is the central bank can enter into areas where possibly which should be the role of the legislators or which should be the role of the government. Okay, so where will you draw the boundary? That is the question. So it is more of an institutional question rather than just a climate change related issue.
Fair enough. So since we're on the topic of institutions and democracy at this point, I think it's a good time to bring you in, Pranav. I think you've read something about corruption in South Africa.
Yeah. As we know, from 2009 to 2018, it was the reign of Jacob Zuma, the president of South Africa. And during his time, it was very, very well known that he lived a very extravagant presidential life and was on an endless spending spree and was charged of corruption. And later he was ousted for corruption, replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa, now the current president. But during this time as president, what he did was he systematically dismantled many of the anti-corruption institutions in South Africa. And the word and the phrase systematically dismantled is quoted by a person named Roger Stone in the Economist's piece. Currently the largest anti-corruption institution is called as the National Prosecution Bureau. It's headed by Shamila Bothoy. She's the new head and she's coming in real strong. The challenge for South Africa right now is how does it remove the burdens placed by the previous administration? Because what happened was within these 10 years, institutions generally are shaped by processes, right? Once a new leader comes, he or she establishes certain kinds of processes which make bureaucratic, which become the bureaucratic norm. So the challenge for the current head of the National Prosecution Bureau, she was previously with the International Criminal Court, is that how do you sort of reverse this process of what has been called as state capturing, where you have essentially established a patronage system in every major institution of the country to only fit parochial needs rather than the public needs or the national needs, right?
I mean, the parallels to India are just so striking.
I was coming to that, and this is parallels to many other systems, because we were also talking about climate change. When I was reading the piece, for me, it was just reminiscent of everyone's talking about the US elections in 2021. And the biggest worry for everyone is in these 4 years, Donald Trump's administration has systematically dismantled a lot of the public institution in charge of climate sciences, science and technology research, and even many institutions of democratic processes, election reform, and so on. All of these have been said to have been damaged for the long term because processes were introduced because of which cannot be reversed just because you have a new leader. Right? A lot of the times we think that we're electing a new leader, therefore we're creating this new system. And this has always been the thing in India, right? We vote for a new leader and we think that we're going to get something dramatically new. But the problem is that the old creeping bureaucratic system still stays the same. A lot of processes still stay the same despite the reform, and leaders also get used to it, right? Leaders realize that they can leverage patronage and they can perpetuate that.
I mean, that's literally essentially how the equation between the police and the state goes, right? The police ends up being an arm of the ruling party as opposed to like an arm of enforcing law and order impartially. And that's because of the institutional capture of the police by political parties. They know that there's this nice patronage nexus going on between them. And it's not a coincidence that every time a new government comes to power, you have a sudden dropping of cases against legislators that have just been elected, even if they have criminal backgrounds.
Yeah. So going back to South Africa again, the good thing is that there is some change happening. Recently, the security minister named Bugami Bongo, he was arrested with charges of corruption because he looted a lot of money from Eskom, which is South Africa's state-owned electricity company, which swiftly brings me to the next story of what could be the real repercussions of looting money from public institutions or dismantling public institution systematically, right? So Eskom recently cut off power to almost all major industrial areas within South Africa.
What?
Yes, they had to shut down the system because they did not have enough money to maintain the power grids. And the South Africans got really irritated, and they went on social media to rant, which gave room to some very dark humor. The Economist quotes one joke where they said the E in South Africa stands for electricity.
The E in South Africa
stands for electricity.
Is there an E in South Africa?
No, that's exactly the point, right? There's no electricity in South Africa. So the company blamed it for bad weather. It was heavily raining. They blamed it for bad weather, but it's not bad weather. They have absolutely no money. I think they have been looted almost about $250 million from the institution, so which makes them almost without money, right? Because of that, and because they still have people within the company who are still taking money, it's becoming very difficult to give what we consider as essential services. Consider this. What would you do without 4 days or 5 days of electricity? If we all run on electronics, your phones run on electronics, everything runs on electronics, right? So this is a massive problem on what can happen if corruption is not taken care of, and even the institutions that are supposed to check corruption are dismantled.
So I think that also kind of dovetails with what I've been reading about, which is about the need for public expenditure when it comes to a lot of these utilities that we often take for granted, specifically in the context of healthcare, right? And I've recently been reading and writing a lot about China, as you'd know. And one interesting statistic I came across yesterday is that China's fertility rate today is roughly the same as that of the Netherlands, whereas its per capita GDP is about 1/5 that of the Netherlands. So what that means in practice is that you're going to have more and more older Chinese people, less young people who are able to pay for their healthcare, pay for their pensions, and so on and so forth. And this is, I think, a perfect illustration of the middle income trap, where China actually is growing older before it grows richer. And that the sort of consequences of China's economic growth, I think, are starting to be felt in more and more areas as well, as this week's edition of The Economist points out. One great example is the way the hukou system works. So are you guys familiar with the hukou system? No. So basically, the hukou system is a kind of permit that determines where you're allowed to work, where you're allowed to reside, where you're allowed to raise a family, where you're allowed to educate your kids, and so on and so forth. And very often, Chinese authorities have used the hukou system as a way to kind of control rural-urban migration. And this is becoming a real problem now as China starts to become an innovation economy, because that necessitates a lot of mobility of labor from rural to urban centers, and especially between urban centers. Now, the kind of people who can usually escape and not really worry about the hukou system are at the either end of the economic spectrum. So either you'll have the super elites who are very well connected within the party network and don't really need to worry about it, or you'll have the really poor migrant workers who don't really care about settling down in one particular location. But when you think about young middle-income Chinese who are working in a startup or something, want to set up a family in Beijing, they can't buy a house, they can't get a car without jumping through all these government hoops. And that potentially is a problem that China is going to have to deal with. We're also seeing that less people are now interested in settling down in Beijing. People are preferring to settle down in Shenzhen and I think Hangzhou. So it's going to be something that China is going to have to deal with. And that's just one of the two stories that talk about the problems that China is facing. The second is the fact that as more and more Chinese become rich, as their diets start to become more sugary, more focused on soft drinks and so on and so forth, we're seeing an increasing incidence of type 2 diabetes, which is not necessarily something that people are very well aware of. In fact, colleges actually discriminate against kids who have diabetes, as do government offices. And the article points out correctly, in my opinion, that China is going to have to really step up its spending game. If its public health infrastructure is going to be able to deal with these kind of chronic diseases that come with development inevitably. The final thing I read about health and expenditure was about tuberculosis. Now, as I'm sure you'd know, up till the 1990s, it seemed like the world was more or less on the verge of eliminating tuberculosis, but that kind of changed because of two big things. The first was the incidence of HIV spreading, which meant that more people had weaker immune systems, which made them more vulnerable to TB. And also the fact that because of antibiotic and drug resistance, it becomes harder and harder to kill tuberculosis. We've kind of been in the doldrums when it comes to TB research for the last couple of decades, but there have been a series of major breakthroughs now. We now have drugs that were incidentally developed in South Africa that are really good at dealing with drug-resistant TB. We have more affordable diagnostic systems that are more widespread, that can more quickly detect different forms of TB, not just active infected individuals, but also individuals who have like the latent form of the disease in their lungs. But all of this, again, is going to need public expenditure to really fuel. It's not something the private sector is going to be able to deal with. And it's especially relevant in developing countries like India, which for some reason doesn't really feature in the Economist article on this. So that's something that we're going to have to look at going forward. So we just have a few more minutes before we wrap up today's episode. I think you, Sarthak, read a really interesting article about Japan and foreign language education, which I think is strikingly relevant to India's case, where we also have a large number of migrants from other states who speak totally different languages. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, Anirudh, I read this article on an Economist. So what they're saying is the schools in Japan, they are becoming less homogeneous. Now, what has happened in Japan? The same thing that you're pointing out, that in Japan also the average life expectancy has increased, and again the fertility rates have gone down. As a result of which, they do not have sufficient number of people who can work, who are in that working age population. So now they are trying to get laborers from outside. So countries like Philippines, Brazil, from there you are having migrant laborers in Japan. Now these people will again have kids. So these kids do not have knowledge about the Japanese language. So the Japanese schools are now dabbling with this problem, that these kids are there who don't understand Japanese language. How do we ensure that they know Japanese language so that they can take a primary education? So this is one of the major problems they are facing. And again, the response to this has been different types. Okay, in some places they have these interpreters. In some places they are offering crash courses. Some places they have volunteers. Now, who are these volunteers? The old Japanese men and women. They are the ones who are volunteering and they are teaching. But again, old people, they cannot do this for longer hours. So again, there is some restriction. Apart from that, it also depends which area you are staying in. If there is an area which has a lot of migrants, there you have different kind of support. But again, there are some areas where you have very few migrants. In that case, you are just on your own. So this is one major problem Japan is facing. And recently what happened was, Japan passed a bill And that bill provides certain role for the national government as well as for the municipalities. What should be their role when it comes to promoting the Japanese language? Also, the bill has provisions for Japanese companies to train their foreign employees with Japanese language. So these are things that they are doing, but we can draw parallels with India as well. In India, we might not have that many immigrants from outside, but in India, migration between the states, between the cities has been increasing. And here also we face different kind of problems. You will find laborers from UP, Bihar in places like Kerala as well. And we have seen this happening before also. In Mumbai also this has been the case. And many times these migrants, it need not necessarily be migrants from specific states. You can also think of migrants who are belonging to certain community. For example, the tribal kids. They find it very difficult to take up new languages, and as a result of which they will drop out of schools. So it is not just a problem of language, it has larger implications, specifically on education and all these things.
Yeah.
But good thing is, in some states in India, we have had policies. Like in Kerala, there have been efforts to train the migrants, to provide them some sort of basic briefing. But we don't see that happening everywhere. Maybe we can also learn this thing from the Japanese government. Okay, what can be the role of the municipalities here?
I'm just wondering how this would interact with India's political tendency towards linguistic nationalism, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because would you see people who are willing to learn other languages? Would you see people who are willing to volunteer to teach other people who... And is this something that we necessarily want the government to do? Is the government the way
it is not something which can be made possibly mandatory. Okay, maybe some incentives can be provided. And also, learning a new language... you cannot force people to learn a new language, but when people see that there is an economic benefit,
exactly, so that's
with the learning of a new language, maybe they will take up.
So that's the key, right? Because I think, especially as Bangalore proves, a lot of immigrants who've come here have not necessarily seen the need to learn Kannada because it's they can get along just fine without it.
You can get along rather easily.
And see, there are upsides and downsides to this equation, right? Because on the one side, it makes it easier for people to move around the country, but on the other side...
See, one thing, Anirudh, here, it also depends on the class you belong to.
Yeah, that is true.
Okay, so if I am belonging to the middle class or the upper middle class, I can manage. I will be knowing some language which can connect me with people, with others, okay? But if I'm belonging to the lower classes, it might be difficult for me.
So this is a lot more relevant for the migrant worker context,
yeah, migrant worker context.
But it seems to me like migrant workers are generally more open to learning new languages than the middle classes are, and the educated people generally are, because it's an economic compulsion, right? You can't sell, for example,
also correct, yeah.
cigarettes to Kannadigas unless you can speak Kannada.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay.
So at a broader level, how do you create incentives for skilled labor to pick up new languages? Because from what you've told me, the people who are going to Japan from Brazil, from the Philippines, don't necessarily tend to be very high skilled laborers. Or am I wrong in that?
They are laborers, but again, yes, may not be high skilled laborers. Okay. Again, the Economist article does not specify what kind of skills they have. It is not being mentioned, but they are saying that yes, there are some places where you have concentration of these kind of workers. See, in the Indian context, you can look at it like this. Okay, maybe the parents will be incentivized to learn. Okay, because they see that direct economic benefit. But what about the kids? They might directly enroll them into schools where the schools might not be teaching from the scratch. Okay, so there we might the children might face difficulties and they might drop out. So to avoid that kind of circumstance, okay, we might have some sort of extra mechanism. See, in schools you go, you are competing with children who, let's say in Bangalore, okay, the children are going and they're competing with children who are already coming from the Kannadiga background. They already know Kannada. They will always have an advantage over these kids who do not know that. So for these kind of kids, what more incentives can be provided in case they are lagging behind? So that is what we can possibly think of.
And then potentially this could really pay off economically as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, because
not just economically, just think about it politically also. Okay, the language divide that is there. Okay, it can lead to cultural assimilation. I mean, people across, it need not necessarily be the fact that you are just associated with one kind of culture. Okay, you are ready to accept new culture. Again, this can be something which can also reduce cultural nationalism. Because there is always this thing that, okay.
No, while I agree with you in principle, I'm just wondering, why would governments in South India, especially who rely on linguistic nationalism to get elected, want to do something else?
They are also getting some economic benefit out of it.
Yeah, so that is really the case that needs to be made, I suppose.
Yeah, just 2 points. Interestingly, that we spoke about what the Japanese government had to do. Interestingly, 2 years ago, India was sending a very large number of nurses to Japan and caretakers because Japan's getting older and they have many senior citizens and they do not have enough young people to take care of the old, right? So a lot of Indian nursing schools, for example, were training their students in Japanese language and some of the cultural aspects so that they can go into Japan seamlessly and transition rather easily. That was one aspect of it, right? The government in India was the state government was trying to do something, particularly in Kerala, to try to incentivize them to go to Japan because you have a higher salary, there's a demand for younger people to go work there, even if it's foreigners and so on.
And it also solves our own unemployment issues, right?
Exactly. Kerala is a really good example of how you can actually use international labor mobility to like benefit the people of your state. Because I think people sending money back from abroad is like remittances are a major source of income for people in Kerala, and it's what led to improving income standards for the last couple of generations
as well.
Yeah. And I think on the second point of linguistic barriers within India itself, I think technology could probably pave the way. Probably an Indian private company or something like a joint cooperative initiative where you can utilize not now, over 10 years, utilize AI to sort of have this national translation system where you could have an app or something which helps you seamlessly translate languages, sort of break cultural barriers. We see a lot of people carry smartphones, and if this app is optimized for various kinds of devices, then definitely I think technology could pave the way for breaking down this linguistic barrier.
Perhaps. I mean, I wish I was that optimistic about technology. If I hadn't seen it constantly being twisted to majoritarian purposes in India at this point. And on that optimistic note,
you broke my optimism there.
Thank you both so much for joining me, and thank you for joining us in All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST. or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, Storytel, and Cambly. And let me tell you a couple of things that you should check out this week. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet is joined by actor Amol Parashar and content strategist at TVF, Akansh Kaur. They talk about the risks and rewards they encountered after quitting their traditional jobs for digital media entertainment. On Advertising is Dead, Varun is joined by business head of Gully Gang Entertainment, Chaitanya Kataria. They discuss the rise of new age music. On Litnama, Lakshmi is in conversation with poet Jasmine Khurana. They discuss the trend of slam poetry. On Football Shutball, Gaurav, Karthik and Siva talk about Man City's visit to the Emirates Stadium. On Simplified, Chuck and Shriketh simplify the impeachment process in the US and discuss the chances of Trump getting impeached. On Geek Fruit, Jishnu is joined by Siddhant Mehta and they do a roundup of the greatest hits and misses of 2019. Thanks and keep listening.
The modern world is obsessed with food and agriculture. Everywhere you look, new and exciting technologies are bringing food innovation to your street market, your grocery store, your doorstep, and your plate. From our quest for the perfect food photos to our rediscovery of ancient grains. Quite simply, food has never been sexier. But guess what? The modern food system is broken. It's a major cause of climate change, antibiotic resistance, and global poverty. So how did we get here, and where are we going? Most importantly, how are we going to feed 10 billion people globally by the year 2050 through better, more sustainable means? I'm Varun Deshpande.
And I'm Ramya Ramurthy. And we work for the Good Food Institute, a global non-profit accelerating the transformation to a more healthy, sustainable, and just food system. The next food revolution is here. On Feeding 10 Billion, we're giving you the inside view. You can tune into us every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts from.